In this tutorial, I introduce promises. Promises were mainly introduced in JavaScript to make the code, asynchronous code, simpler and to remove many of the complexities of callbacks, especially the callback health. Promises were made native in ECMAScript 2016. A promise is simply an object that allows you to handle asynchronous operations. The main advantages is to make the code easier to read. You still have the combined error handling, better control flow. You still can do async actions in parallel or series. Many promises can be running at the same time. A promise constructor takes a callback with two arguments. Resolve is one, two is reject. Resolve is a callback that should be invoked when the async operation is completed. No problem, everything is fine, then resolve is invoked. Reject, on the other hand, will be invoked when there is a problem or an error. A promise has three states: either fulfilled, rejected, or pending. When you start a promise, the promise is pending. If it's successful, then it is fulfilled. If there is a problem, then it is what? Rejected. Finally, the promise will be settled. In order to study promises, we're going to use a new file system library, external library for nodes called fsextra. The good thing about fsextra, it works with promises. It still works with callbacks, but also works with promises. All fs methods return promises unless you provide a callback function. We will show you two different examples. How to install fsextra, like any other external library in Node, npm install fsextra. This is how you create an object from fsextra. Let's look at the first example. I'm using the formal syntax. It might be a bit complex in the beginning, but later you're going to get used to it. We are trying to open the students file, same file we did with callbacks. This is almost the same function we called when we used callbacks. But now, instead of using callbacks here in this get students, see no callback is provided. We are returning a new promise. As I explained first, promise takes two parameters, resolve and reject functions. So here we are using fsextra to read the file, but this time we are using callback. So when you are reading the file, still there is a callback here. You could have an error or no error. The difference is, now if you have an error, you don't call back a function, since you don't have a callback function to get the students. You just call reject. If there is no error, you don't call back a function, you just call what? Resolve. So now how to call this function? Get students dot then or dot catch. You need to use both, of course. Dot then is used when the promise resolves. It means when the promise sends data. Dot catch will only be used if the promise rejects or returns an error. See now the difference between callbacks and promises. When you call the getStudents function, you did not provide a callback function. And here inside the function, you do not call a callback function since you don't have one. You either call reject or resolve. Maybe when using one function, you don't see the difference between promises and callbacks and how come it reduces the complexity. But when you have so many promises, you will see that apparently helping you how to handle and manage the code. In next examples, I'll use a simplified code with promises, but this is the formal code or how to use promises when you read files. This is the simplified code. Instead of using this complete code to just read a file using promises, we're going to read a file using a promise, and this function will do the same. See the difference now? fs read file. Remember, as I said before, when you use fs from fs extra, if you do not provide a callback, then it returns a promise. Here, we are reading this file without providing a callback. Since this is going to be a promise, we can use then. Then means when the promise resolves, when the promise returns data. If you use then here, dot then data, convert the data to JSON, return the data. That's it. You still can call the function the same way you called it before. Get student, then dot. You can catch an error here. If there is an error, it will be caught here. So this is a simplified version. If you look at the code again, since you are not providing a callback, then the fs read of fs extra will return a promise. Here we were providing a callback. In this example, we are just returning a promise, and when the promise resolves, we get the data and return the data. Remember, you need to return the data. When the data returns now, it will be returned here to the calling function. Of course, you cannot use promises in synchronous code. Like this, you cannot do a read a file using fs extra and then console.log. No way. You either need to use a promise or a callback with fs extra. This code will generate an error. The error is, if you look at this, promise is pending. Promise is pending means the promise has not yet been fulfilled or nor rejected. This is a code. We use two promises in this code. We have done this with callbacks. I'm still using the full version of the promises. Promise, resolve, reject, and then you read a file with a callback. But let me show you how to chain promises. Now we're going to call the first promise, get the result, then call the second one. So this is the promise. Both promises do the same thing. They open a file, they get the data, convert it to JSON, and do some filtering, and then resolve. Resolve means, again, return. So we are calling it from here, get student. We are calling the first one. Now we say dot then. Dot then means what? When the promise sends you back the data. Promises send back the data using resolve. You get the student. You can call the next promise now, get program name. This one, get program name, again will return a promise. This will return program name. Program name is returned here. So this is how you chain promises when you have multiple promises, and you still can catch the error this way. Yani you keep saying then, dot catch. Of course, if there is any error while reading the file in those particular functions, they will be rejected. If they are rejected, the error will be caught here. Again, this is the full version. If you want to look at the simplified code, this code does more than that. It reads 3 files. Okay, it reads 3 files using the simplified code. Again, you need to remember that fs extra returns a promise if you don't use a callback function. In the previous examples, I used callback function. That's why the code was a bit long. But in this example, I just returned the promise. Dot then, when the promise resolves, convert the data using JSON, return students. Get courses, same thing. Dot then, data, convert the courses, return them. Get staff, convert, return. I'm using then here. This is a promise since fs extra When you read file fs extra, it returns a promise. So how you chain promises here in this simple code? You call get students dot then return get courses dot then every time the data returned from the function will be received here in the dot then get promises dot then students. Students is the thing that was returned from here. Courses is the thing that was returned from here. You still can call the third function. I have not called it here, but you still can call the third and fourth function. And as you see here, you can catch the error. So if there is an error in any function, the error will be caught here. How you call chained promises? You can use either functions or the same way I did before. Get student, then student one, get next one, then until you reach the last one where you use catch. Or you can use functions like this, then function student, return get program name, function program name. The second one is considered more professional and most popular. Now we see chaining promises, but 3 promises. And with the formal code, full code here, same thing, you need to read the first one. When it resolves, it sends data here. When you call the second one, when it resolves, it sends data to the second one. And the third one, when it resolves. See, I am calling all the promises from here, one after the other. The code is asynchronous, of course, and I'm calling them from the same function. And I call the function from here, get data. I just want to bring your attention to this one here. When you have chained or you use arrow functions, you might end up with a scope problem. Scope problem means this student object will not be visible in this scope. A typical way to solve it, if you still need to use the student object in other subsequent promises, you solve the problem with what they call in JavaScript lexical this. In lexical this here, I just used another student object with a scope of the function, and I gave it the same reference to this one. So students equal a student, the one that was returned. This way, the student object is visible and reachable from everywhere in the function. Otherwise, you could end up with undefined problems due to scope problems. One last example. This one is a bit different. I'm not using promises one after the other. Here, I will be calling one promise, and that promise is going to call other promises. It's like, if you will, you can call it nested promise. In this code, I will call getStudent, but I don't want only the student object. I want the student object, the course names he is enrolled in, and the program name. In order to get the course names and program name, I need to read 2 more files. Let's see how this thing is done. I call the first one with the student ID. It returns a promise, but before returning to me, it will call the second function, which returns a promise, get course names. This is get course names. Get course names, it will go and open the course file. And then filter. It will return only those courses where the student is enrolled. We can know which courses the student is enrolled in by using one of the arrays in the student object. It's called course IDs. So we filter them and return the course names. Now, this function will resolve or send its data back to this. Again, the function, this one, will call a third one here. We need the program name. In order to get the program name, we need to open another file and match the program code of the student with the program name in that file, and we need to return it. This one will return the code here, the result, and this one will return it here. And as you see, finally, this promise will return the student object to the caller. Yani this getStudent.then will be resolved when we get the return statement, which is almost resolved now, to this one. So you can get it. Of course, you can catch an error if you want, but here we are already catching all the errors. So we are calling the first promise. The promise now is calling other promises. Other promises need to resolve to the calling promise. Once all promises called and fulfilled, our promise, the one we call directly, will resolve with the data to us. Using promises is much simpler than using callbacks. And if your code is simplified, you can tell that it's easier, much easier than using callbacks. I can show you this example. In callbacks, we at least need double the number of lines, and the code tracking will be very difficult. What I want you here to know that the promises are called from a promise, which is a typical JavaScript technique. And the called promise will resolve on all the promises that he has called, resolved or reported back to him. Promises solve 50% of the problem of callbacks, 50% or more. However, we still need to use callbacks in one way or another. If you use the full version of file read, you still see the code is a bit complicated, like what you see here. However, promises were replaced by async await. Async await was introduced in 2017-18, and they make your code, asynchronous JavaScript code, work asynchronously, but written very simply the same way you did with synchronous JavaScript.